Hi, it's Rachel here again. I just thought I'd make a brief video to catch you up with what's happening in New Zealand. As many of you who may watch some of my videos will know, I have followed what's been happening with the Gloriavale religious community, which is on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand. It's an isolated group of about 600 members at the moment. Half of them at least are just children, and they have been in the news rather a lot over the last couple of years. Last year, I think it was last year, or maybe 18 months ago, a number of leavers, Gloriavale leavers, they prefer to be called leavers rather than ex-members, some of the males took their leaders of the community and also the Labour Inspectorate to court, to the employment court, to get a ruling that they are in fact employees of the leaders of that religious community rather than volunteers. And what had happened in the past is when the Labour Inspectorate had gone into the religious community to look at the working conditions for the people there, they had come away having a positive view of it. But a lot of facts had been hidden from them. Anyway, the result of that court case was that it was ruled that the men were actually employees. Then later last year, and then concluding in the first quarter of this year, a number of female leavers decided to do the same thing. Their situation was a little different because they were doing mainly domestic duties inside the community, but these domestic duties were performed on an industrial scale. They had like commercial industrial type kitchens, laundry, sewing rooms. They actually ran a school and daycare, so they had women carrying out roles on a rostered basis, and it was grueling hard work. From a young age, from the age of 6, they start their children into a work schedule, and when they turn 15, they basically finish school and have like a year work experience, if you like. And when they turn 16, they are on duties the same as the adults there, and it's grueling work. Often they're up 4, 5 in the morning and not really stopping until, you know, late into the evening. So it's grueling work. So the girls, when they went to court, it was a bit, you know, I wasn't terribly confident that they would get the same judgment as the boys, that they would be found to be employees and not just volunteers. But it was wonderful. The judge ruled that they were in fact in an employment relationship. There might not have been like an employment contract, but the relationship between these women who started working as girls with the community was one of employment, and therefore they deserved all the rights and protections that employees in New Zealand get. Because up until that point, when the Labour Inspectorate, who work under the Ministry of Business, Innovations and Employment, when they had gone into the various businesses that the community run, and it's usually the men that work in these outside businesses, which are like mainly farms, honey, hunting. They've had a few different, sphagnum moss. Over the years they've had a few different types of businesses, and generally speaking it's the men that work in those roles, but the women, their choices for work were pretty much limited to domestic duties. Anyway, yes, that the judge saw that both the men and the women were in employment and that they should have had the protections as employees, but when the Labour Inspectorate had gone in to look, they had come away with the belief that they are just volunteers, and therefore they, as volunteers, they are not guaranteed any rights as employees. But the judge in both of the court cases found that they were, both the men and the women were in an employment relationship. So that means that now they can go after the leaders for recompense. You know, they can demand payment because they never saw any money for their volunteering, and many of them suffered injuries. It was grueling hard work. They are often deprived of their families because they'd be taken away from their families for so many hours a day. And in fact, the women, once they had the women there, basically breeders. They believe it their God-given duty and privilege, if you like, to produce as many children as possible, and it's actually considered a sin to not try to get pregnant. They have to be popping out a baby almost every year, and you can imagine that generates an awful lot of work. So when these women would have a child, they'd be given about 2 weeks with their baby, and then their baby would be shipped off into the daycare centre there. And so other mothers would be looking after their children. You wouldn't really get to raise your own family. They'd be taken into the care of the community in general. So it's really very, very sad. You know, for a Christian community that's supposed to have a focus on the family and the value of family relationships, they certainly don't allow families to develop really good, strong relationships and to develop and grow. They become possessions of the community as a group. So anyway, so exciting things are happening there, and it's not over because, like I said, now the leavers can go back to court and seek payment for their work in arrears. So it's hard to see how that will go, because the religious community's leaders say they can't afford to do that, which I think they've got a few assets they could liquidate, extra land. They could stop sending money overseas where they're trying to grow other cults over there. And if they stop producing so many children, their costs would go down dramatically. Anyway, we'll see what happens there. But it was very clearly a win for the Gloriavale leavers. What was really exciting about the court cases and the judgment at the end from the judge, it's like 72-page judgment. I've just read the summary of it. She clearly saw how people raised in a community like that from birth, how they don't have choices. They're not aware of choices. So when the leaders would say that the people there are volunteers, they really didn't know any different. Volunteering suggests choice, doesn't it? And will. But they were born into this group and predestined to fill out the roles that were prescribed for them by the leaders, which for women was domestic duties, and for the men was working on the farms and other businesses they had. And they have a very strong focus on work. Basically, if you don't want to work the way they tell you to, then you're not welcome in the community and you will have to leave. And that would mean you'd be separated from your family, your extended family, your children, wife, husband, in the community. So there's a lot of pressure to just conform. So that doesn't align with the thought of volunteering, does it? Not at all. So the judge recognised that she saw undue influence and coercive control, and she understood what that was and how it occurred there. And my hope is that with this ongoing focus on what's happening with Gloriavale, because it's still, you know, in the news a lot, and there's still ongoing court cases, and like before the Human Rights Review Tribunal, there's something before them at the moment, it may draw attention to other groups that also use coercive control and undue influence. For example, in the Jehovah's Witnesses, when children, particularly when they're born in and raised as Jehovah's Witnesses and make a decision to be baptized, can we truly say that is really a voluntary decision? It's been heavily influenced. Their choices, their information has all been limited, and there's a lot of pressure on them to be baptized. So I'm keeping a close eye on what's happening there. So another thing that's happening in New Zealand is that in October, first half of October, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Australasia branch representatives will be in the High Court here in Wellington. They are seeking a judicial review and a declaratory judgment, I think I've said that right, from the High Court, saying that they should not be included in the abuse and care inquiry that's been happening in New Zealand for the last, I think, 5 years. The Jehovah's Witnesses have been investigated, as far as I'm aware. There's been a number of ex-witness survivors of child sexual abuse that have given their testimony privately to the commissioners over the last few years, and I understand that representatives from the branch have been in New Zealand and talked with the commission, but they have sworn black and blue the whole time that they should never have been included in the inquiry because they do not have children in their care. So the commission clearly thought otherwise. They must have been convinced that they did have significant control over children and, of course, the parents of children. So they were included. So the Australasia branch is hoping that the High Court will agree with them and that they shouldn't be included. So we're still, the inquiry has stopped hearing evidence now and collecting evidence as of the end of, it was either June or July. And now they're working on preparing a final report of their findings and their recommendations, which is due in June 2024. So it'll be interesting to see what their recommendations are. And I know a lot of the survivors and representatives for the survivors have been wanting mandatory reporting of child abuse, because we don't have any mandatory reporting in New Zealand at the moment. So that's something that they all want, and perhaps an independent body for abuse survivors to report to, rather than reporting back to the institution that's responsible for their abuse in the first place. So we'll see what recommendations the Commission makes, and it seems like, from what I've seen, that they're very sympathetic. But as we've seen from ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in the UK and Wales, they haven't taken up a lot of the recommendations from the Commission. The government hasn't, because the Commission will put their recommendations to government, and then the government has to decide on them. So it remains to be seen what will happen in New Zealand. But personally, I would like to see mandatory reporting, and I do not want to see that clergy penitent exception to reporting, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses resort to in other countries where there is mandatory reporting. If there's that clergy penitent loophole, then they will use it, and they will fight tooth and nail to keep it and spend dedicated funds in court defending their right to use that clergy penitent exception. So hopefully, even if the Jehovah's Witnesses succeeded with the High Court and were excluded from the inquiry, which would be very devastating because a number of other religious institutions would follow suit, those ones that don't operate schools, boarding schools, any other residential care where children are actually apart from their parents. So yeah, there could be a terrible domino effect if the Jehovah's Witnesses are successful in the High Court, which I hope they are not, of course. So that's coming up in October, and as far as I'm aware, a few ex-witnesses from around the country are going to converge there in court to hear the proceedings. So that will be interesting. So a third thing that's happened in New Zealand that's been quite exciting is back in March, April, we had a journalist from RNZ, that's Radio New Zealand. That's quite a good online news source in New Zealand, and for the most part reputable. And there's a lovely journalist there called Anusha Bradley, who's a investigative journalist who likes to dig deep into stories, gets quite involved in them, and she was approached, I believe, by a former witness, and she decided that she would like to dig deep and do a series of articles on the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I got to speak with her and quite a few ex-witnesses around the country, some who had left decades ago, others very, very recently, as last year, some that are actually still in, who are PMO, physically in, mentally out. So yeah, all kinds of people with all kinds of information she was able to interview and put together an excellent, her first article was a long read. It was called Something Evil, which I think is a great title, and she drew that from a quote from me. So I think it describes very well how ex-members are made to feel when they are shunned, when we are ostracised. We are made to feel like we are something evil. And then, of course, the practice of shunning itself is something evil. It's very evil. So if you haven't read that first article, I'll put the link below in the description so you can check it out. She followed up her first article, which was mainly about shunning and whether there's anything we can do legally about shunning, just raising some questions there in the article about, is this something we really want in the 21st century? And she followed it up with 2 articles about how Jehovah's Witnesses handle sexual abuse of children in the congregations. And she revealed some rather alarming information about there being, and this will be the tip of the iceberg, 11 either convicted or confessed child sexual abusers in the congregations presently. One an elder, and I think another is a ministerial servant. And the thing she brought out was that they were in the congregations without most of the members being aware of them being there. So I'm hoping that Jehovah's Witnesses, even though they're told not to look at any critical information because it's poison, don't touch, I'm hoping they're curious enough to have a look to see what the world, what the reporter, what people are saying about Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'll put the links to all the articles in the description. There was also a video and a podcast type video and a radio. She did comment on the radio as well. So there was, you know, some quite good coverage there. But we kind of need to keep it going. So that's exciting for us. Something else I've found that's making me feel quite encouraged is we have a new website that has been started by a group of ex-witnesses that are scattered around the globe, and they've called it shunningisacrime.org. And shunning is a crime is all put together, it's like one word. And the main focus on their website is to gather information to put to legislators to help prove that shunning is actually a human rights violation. And they also want to be able to fund, and so they want supporters for funding towards court proceedings and that sort of thing, you know, because you know, we're fighting against the Jehovah's Witness organisation, which, you know, has a lot of money. So I think this is an excellent initiative, and I feel like we've needed something like this for a long time. And they've actually been asking people to send in their experience, you know, briefly, their experience of shunning in particular and how it's harmed them. Because I think the world in general is still not really very clued up on this. And I think if you were following what was happening in Norway last year, in the years previously, the Jehovah's Witnesses in Norway, or whichever branch I guess is responsible for them there, was saying that they hadn't had complaints from ex-members about the harms of shunning. They said that all there were a few complaints from a handful of disgruntled ex-members. So I thought, you've got to be kidding. If you go onto XJW subreddit, where there's about 90,000 people complaining about shunning, you know, the cry is loud. But of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't want to know that. And if they did want to know, they would have a complaints department or something, or some kind of department to resolve issues like that. But they don't want to hear from ex-members. We are shunned. They're not going to hear our complaints. So we've got to put our complaints together and into it like a huge dossier that can be presented to the legal, you know, authorities, so they can see that it's not just a handful of people. So I would encourage everyone to go to that shunningisacrime.org website, check it out and see if you can contribute. I know I will be. And I've just seen there's another, what was it called? Someone has just put together a series of videos on, I guess, on healing after coming out of the watchtower. And off the top of my head, I just can't remember what it's called, but I'll put a link below. And I've also just come across this morning a video from someone, she's got a British accent, so I guess it's in the UK, some ex-witnesses who are wanting to fundraise to make a 97-minute long, I think, documentary about Jehovah's Witnesses. So that could be exciting to be involved in, especially if you're over there, and they're calling for people to get in touch with them too about their experiences in the organisation. So she did say they want to expose the truth about the truth. Because some years ago, if you remember, there was a documentary that had been started. They did a lot of filming for, but that all turned south, and I'm not going to get into reasons why that happened, but that was very disappointing. So hopefully this new initiative will actually go right through to fulfillment and we will see it on our screens. That would be wonderful. Anyway, I think that's about all I was going to say for today. I hope I made sense, and I will see you next time, probably after the October High Court hearing. Anyway, bye.